right. Well, welcome everybody to a wonderful podcast here on Book and Spade. I am your familiar host, John Evans, Lutheran seminarian, and I'm here with, of course, my excellent and blessed friend and colleague, Dr. Lydia McGrew. Blessed to have you with us today.
Thank you, John, for having me.
In today's recording, I wanted to review some of the issues related to Johannine authorship, particularly related to the breadth of the fourth gospel, but also possibly other texts. The fourth gospel, of course, is one of your main specialities, Lydia, with the text, The Eye of the Beholder.
Yes, I was really glad that got the kind of blurbs that it did, endorsements that it did, because that shows that even though I am going up against mainstream scholarship, that I have something to say that is, considered to be worth listening to. So I hope we can get that out to a wider audience.
Absolutely, and that's partly why I'm doing this. So that basically that those in the popular fields, but also fellow academic colleagues, can at least understand the reality that these arguments are worth listening to, particularly if you are someone who believes in the authority of the biblical text and the eyewitness sources behind the text. So let's get our first business out into the public, the authorship of the fourth gospel. For those on a more popular level, Lydia, how would you explain the trajectory? Because it seems as though anyone who opens up their wonderful red leather New Testaments is going to find that, of course, John is John. Where does this difficulty come in? Is it just with the higher critics in the 19th century? What happened along the way?
Yeah, there was really not a serious question about the authorship of John for a very long time. The patristic evidence is unanimous about its being written by a disciple of Jesus named John, who was the beloved disciple, as the book itself states. But because it's got a lot of theological reflection, I think it became a real target for the higher critics because there was a false dichotomy between theology and history. So there was this idea that if it starts off by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that had to be a later development rather than being historical. And we've been sort of trying to bend the stick back in the opposite direction ever since. And mainstream scholarship has maybe backed off a little bit in that it's no longer so popular to say that it was written in the 2nd century. For a long time, it was this very late dating from the higher critics. That's been largely abandoned to where it falls within a time frame, even according to liberal scholars, that would be possible to have been written by a disciple of Jesus in his old age. But they have not backed off on the idea that it contains a lot of made-up material and that it's less historical even than the synoptic gospels are. So that's a brief history of the authorship debate on John.
Now, would you say that some archaeological evidence played a part here? I know it's not your specialty. It's certainly not mine. I'm only a novice at that part. But that wasn't there a papyri P52 found in Alexandria of a Johannine text? I think it's like John chapter 18, the pilot narrative, which dates to the 90s. Didn't that upset the 2nd century consensus? Or am I just confused?
Yeah, no, that fragment really was influential. I have to say right here that I don't think it was absolutely decisive that it dated to the 1st century. Scholars can still debate that, but it really did move the discourse. For one thing, because if the gospel was written elsewhere, it had to have time to migrate and be recopied to be found in Alexandria. So that itself tended to push it back. I think sometimes Christians overstate it. Like after that, it's like inconceivable that it could be 2nd century. It's not exactly inconceivable, but it definitely changed the probabilities in mainstream scholarship. But what I think we find is that every time mainstream scholarship backs off on something like this, they just become all the more doubled down on sort of what remains, what they haven't backed off on, so that you never really find them, backing off and saying, "Oh, wow, yeah, this is a really historical gospel." They'll maybe back off and say, "Well, there's some history in it, but it's not robustly historical," and that they're never going to give up on.
Yeah. Well, one of the elements that was most convincing to me in my deep dive before listening to your work for the first time on YouTube was the chain of custody between the Gospel of John and the individual who I personally believe to be John, the son of Zebedee. If I look at the gap between the works of Alexander the Great and archaeological records, at least from what I can gather, it's separated by continents over centuries. The same could be said for, Plato and Aristotle. We have very, very minimal manuscript evidence spread across, centuries and I believe even continents. What we have with John is John, the son of Zebedee, uh, dies somewhere in the 90s in Ephesus. He has disciples, Papias, Polycarp, who have disciples of their own, Irenaeus, of Leon, who leave behind writing, literal texts that attest to the authorship, not just of John, but the rest of the New Testament. And they also attest to the fact that there is a wide, manuscript body of evidence. That gap of evidence is way closer. It's only the two generations, really. I mean, it's one if you're talking about Papias. So I guess my question is, for me, that's a very decisive argument in and of itself. What does these patristic sources tell us about authorship? And is it a knockout punch, really, against the hierarchical consensus, which seems to somehow wiggle their way out of such a tight chain of custody?
Well, I do think the patristic evidence is a knockout. I want to issue one slight correction. We don't have a text by Papias himself in which Papias opines on the authorship of John. He does talk about, knowing John, and I believe that the John, that he listened to was the son of Zebedee. Of course, as you know, there's a different set of ideas that the John that Papias had a chance to talk to was a different guy named John, but he doesn't explicitly say that he was the author of John. However, Irenaeus indicates that Polycarp, did. So while we don't have Papias opining on it, I don't think Irenaeus is making that up. Of course, someone like Bart Ehrman will say, yeah, the Gospels were all anonymous, and then Irenaeus came along and slapped Post-it notes on them with the names of people that he wanted to attribute them to. And I think that's definitely wrong. One of the earliest things we have is actually a quotation from Ptolemy the Gnostic in a debate where the patristic source is debating over the interpretation of John with Ptolemy the Gnostic, not over the authorship. They seem to both agree that it was written by John, the disciple of Jesus. And then, they're just disagreeing about whether it's Gnostic or not. And I find that very interesting because it shows that even opponents of Christianity were acknowledging that it, was written by this disciple of Jesus. And then the Christians, they might have just said, the Gnostics are using this. Let's abandon it then. Let's just say it's not canonical. But they actually instead, they treat it as definitely canonical. Justin Martyr doesn't name the author, but he does quote from the fourth gospel, from Jesus' dialogue with Nicodemus about being born of the Spirit. So there's definitely this, I think, very knockdown patristic evidence. In fact, there's no patristic evidence to the contrary. It's unanimous. What we have is completely unanimous.
So, out of curiosity, we know that two Johns are referred to in the passage in Papias, although I think the construction of the Greek allows it to be the same John. I take it to be the same John, John the presbyter, and I think John is just referred to simply by his name earlier, or among the apostles. And then we have Irenaeus quite just unilaterally calling John John. I know Bauckham disagrees, but to be honest, there's only one real John he could be talking about in light of those sources. He never distinguishes between several Johns. Is it only until we get Eusebius that we get a bifurcation of Johns? And what may have been motivating Eusebius in the fourth century for making such a very strong claim regarding bifurcating the one John into two?
Right. Well, here's a very interesting fact, though. Eusebius does say that there were two Johns, but he attributes the authorship of the fourth gospel specifically to the son of Zebedee. I mean, like so explicitly that no one can even get around it. Even Bauckham can't get around it. In Irenaeus, Bauckham tries to say that Irenaeus's phrase, John, the disciple of the Lord, means the other John, the so-called John the Elder. So in a sense, Eusebius is one of the most emphatic, most explicit witnesses we have to, or if I don't want to say witnesses, but, patristic sources we have to the authorship of the gospel by the son of Zebedee. But he does say there was a different one, and he interprets Papias as referring to a different person who was a disciple of Jesus named John, because he wants to attribute revelation to that guy. And so Eusebius, it's a matter of eschatology. He disagrees with the eschatology there of revelation, so he wants to attribute it to somebody else. I agree with you in the interpretation of that Papias passage that it's just one John. He's just referring to him in two different ways. And I do have an entire appendix of my book, The Eye of the Beholder, on that other John question. I did it deliberately like that because there are some very, really genuinely conservative people, not just faux conservative, who agree with Bauckham that it was written by a different person named John, but they think it was really historical and so forth. So I wanted to tread lightly in the body of the book on that. So my chapter on authorship in the body of the book is such that it could be accepted by a Bauckhamite or a non-Bauckhamite, but then I tackle the Bauckham thesis in the appendix, and I really feel that he has to make some very strained arguments to say that the John, the disciple of the Lord, is this other guy named John. It's like an old joke. Homer didn't write Homer's poetry. It was another guy by the same name. But in fact, the only meaning of Homer we have is the guy who wrote Homer's poetry. So it's really, I think it ends up being very artificial and ad hoc to say it was written by someone else by the same name who had so many properties in common with the son of Zebedee.
And let's point out some of those common properties, because I remember when, I will not name the beautiful and I'm sure erudite scholars who went through this when I was first encountering the Gospels. I'd always hear, well, the author of the fourth Gospel is this bureaucratic figure in Jerusalem, maybe of a high priestly lineage. He knows Caiaphas. Look at the sophisticated style. To quote the King and I, etc., etc., etc. On my end, I've never seen those arguments as being convincing. Precisely, why can't the son of a fishing magnate with huge amounts of servants in the boat in the Gospel of Mark, which means they have money, have contacts in Jerusalem? Why, of course, then is the beloved disciple in the fishing boats at the very end of the Gospel of John, if he's this upper crust elite kind of character? And of course, why can't John focus on Jerusalem when he could have had a ministry there for an extensive period of time, as the book of Acts states? What are some of these commonalities that we find between the beloved disciple and John, the son of Zebedee? And how are we to push back against the critical arguments that would try to suggest that John the fishermen who probably had other talents and other desires and other interests. To push back against those who would say that he couldn't have composed the text.
Right. Well, some of the commonalities are, of course, the name. Now, it was a popular name, so that's not a very strong argument. But his being a close disciple of Jesus, his being not listed among the 12. I have a unique argument. I don't think anyone else has made this exact same argument, that only the 12 are present at the Last Supper. So if you have two different Johns, you have to have them both being present at the Last Supper. So you have to have the 12 and then this extra guy who's also named John, who's not a member of the 12, who's present at the Last Supper. I think that's implausible. They both have to be associated with Peter to a pretty strong extent. So, for example, when Mary Magdalene comes, she's there and she finds Peter with the beloved disciple, and they go together to the tomb. So there's, and then in Acts, you find Peter and John, clearly John, the son of Zebedee, who are major spokesman. So you've got that association with Peter, but it's like, no, that's two different guys who have that association with Peter. So after a while, it gets to be really ad hoc to envisage this other person. Now, you mentioned the argument about being acquainted with the high priest, and this is mentioned in the Passion narrative in John. It says he was known to the high priest, and the Greek word there is gnostos. Now, this was one of those places where I had to really delve into the meaning of a Greek word in the eye of the beholder. And I want to say up here, right out front, I have nothing to hide. I do not read Greek. This has been used to, dismiss my work by people who say you're going up against New Testament scholars, credentialed New Testament scholars, and you don't even read Greek. You'll hear it, out there in the little corners in which people talk about me. I'm not saying I'm famous, but to the extent that they do and want to discredit my work. Now, for that very reason, I sent my manuscript to people who really know Greek, okay, and even, multiple other languages as well. So, for example, Peter J. Williams, my goodness, I don't even have a count of all the languages that guy reads: Syriac and Greek and Aramaic and all this stuff. And the chapters on Johannine idiom, I sent to 3 people specifically and told them, focus on those chapters. Make sure I haven't made any just blunders, mistakes. So I wanted that checked, and the unanimous verdict among the people that I checked with were, no, these are matters where credentialed scholars can legitimately disagree. And that includes the matter of the meaning of this word gnostos. In fact, Westcott, and nobody is going to say, oh, Westcott doesn't know his Greek. You actually find Westcott talking about this. That word has a semantic range. It can go from acquaintances to close friends to even relatives. But it doesn't have to mean close friends and relatives. So when it says he was known to the high priest, that does not mean necessarily, in terms of the semantic range of the word, that if the high priest saw John the beloved disciple, he was going to go, my old buddy, give him a big hug, pat him on the back, like we are close friends, maybe we're even cousins or something. It isn't going to have to mean that. It can just mean acquainted with. So what I do for an analogy here, I read a lot of Victoriana, novels and things set in and coming from authors in the Victorian period that we in modern America are unacquainted with. You could have this huge household. You could have only a few people who maybe live there as sort of the masters of the household, but then you have all of these servants, and then you have the guy who comes and cleans the boots, and you have the guy who comes and sells fish, and the guy who comes and sells meat and so forth, and they're known to the household. Okay, the master of the house might even run into them from time to time, and like, here's the guy who comes to wind the clocks. Hi, guy who comes to wind the clocks. He might know him, but not in the sense of being close to him. And I think that's actually a pretty good analogy. This was the palace of the high priest. And you've even got soldiers and servants sitting around, like out in the courtyard. So the person, the son of Zebedee, could be known. They needn't be super rich, but well off enough at least to have some servants, and they could be selling fish. That's just a conjecture. Bauckham dismisses that almost with anger or contempt, like, no way, they would have been buying fish from him. But I think that's a pretty dogmatic argument about social strata there. And I think we should be treating John as a first century document, and we shouldn't be overly dogmatic about who could or couldn't be gnostos to the high priest. So, that would be my answer.
Oh, certainly. And I see no reason why someone who was primarily the son of a fisherman couldn't have had strong theological interest and curiosity as well. I mean, what's very evident to me is that Paul was a tent maker and a Pharisee. So, you have the Qumran community that is nearby. I'm sure that there were other communities of interest in Galilee in the north. And who knows? I mean, John, the son of Zebedee, could have been listening with Andrew to the ministry of the Baptist. There are other elements which are just absolutely unknown. So it definitely raises the elements in my mind. Who are we as contemporary scholars to dismiss glimpses into the first century world from the first century text?
Yes, I agree. And as far as theological interests, I very strongly agree that anyone who was a disciple of Jesus, and even referred to as the disciple Jesus loved, it should go without saying, Jesus was a very deep theological teacher. Jesus, who was himself the son of a carpenter. Okay, so he's gathering these people around him probably while they're quite young. I think it's even possible that the author was a teenager at the time. I'm not going to, bet the farm on that, but I think it's possible. So coming under that stamp of the mind of Jesus at a young and impressionable age, and having a close relationship with him. As far as style, I wanted to make a quick point here. The Johannine style, and this is not my idea solely, nor is it a conservative idea solely. The style of the fourth gospel is rather simple Greek. You can contrast the fourth gospel with Luke, and in fact, certain ways in which it is simple Greek are the very ways in which scholars identify what they call Johannine style. So, for example, the love of that conjunction kai, which could correspond to the Aramaic vav, I think it's pronounced. And so, John just loves kai. He uses kai, and in places where the author of Luke would certainly use a pair of subordinating conjunctions, nonetheless, or because, more complex sentence structure and so forth. So the very Greek style that is the most distinctive, not only of the fourth gospel, but also of the first epistle, is a simple and Aramaic style. So that this does not have to be someone like highly educated in Greek rhetoric, etc. In fact, he almost certainly was not. And even if he made use of an amanuensis, a secretary to write for him, one of the most interesting things then is the way in which such a hypothetical secretary, if he existed, retained that distinctive oral style and that distinctive vividness of the person speaking orally of things that he actually knew and didn't smooth it out. So I'll just throw in something here that's kind of interesting. Dr. Michael Licona is someone I've written to disagree with quite a bit. In his 2020 series of videos that were responding to some of my criticisms, he theorized that the amanuensis of John, for whom we have no strong independent evidence, but may have existed, would have introduced John to these fact-changing compositional devices from that he says, Licona says, existed in Greek literature. And so then the very strange thing is that you imagine, I called him Apollos. I'm just making up the name, this hypothetical Apollos, who's an amanuensis who's saying, hey, John, I learned this really cool stuff about changing the time when things happened in your book. Would you like to do that? And John, the beloved disciple, says, sure, Apollos, go ahead. And then Apollos says, now listen, I'm not gonna clean up your Greek. I'm not gonna make your Greek particularly high level. And John, the beloved disciple, says, sure, go ahead, change some of the facts, but don't make my Greek any higher styled. That's like exactly the opposite. An amanuensis normally existed for the purpose of making your Greek higher styled. So here we have this tension in the portrayal of this alleged amanuensis who's introducing rhetorical fact-changing devices, but not changing the Greek style. That's all. That just makes no sense whatsoever.
It makes absolutely no sense, and also too, it doesn't really fit with the fact that not only the Greek is retained in its roughness, if you want to use that terminology, or compared to Luke. But also the fact that, generally speaking, there aren't many explanatory notes over very obscure first century details. Caiaphas was high priest that year, clearly referring to the messy rotating priesthood, or the fact that why is Jesus taken to the house of Annas first before being taken to Caiaphas, or taken to the person of Annas in the same house. There's just these quirky first century details, which I would assume an amanuensis later on would basically say, well, this is not pertinent to our audience, or try to offer an explanatory note. I think in the Gospel of Mark, for example, over hand washing, the amanuensis inserts, or someone inserts, this is a ritual of hand washing which is among the Jews to this day, to explain what on earth they're talking about. It might be in Matthew instead.
No, it's Mark.
It's Mark.
It is Mark. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you that, the closest you have in John that I can think of would be the elaborate burial with spices. And John does say, as is the custom of the Jews, to bury. So he puts that one in. But there are other things, like he says Jesus stood up on the last day, the great day of the feast, in John 7, referring to the Feast of Tabernacles. And, he doesn't pause and give this big gloss on it. There are also unexplained allusions that I would strongly agree with you that a polishing amanuensis would want to take out. So in John 2, it is in between the marriage at Cana and the temple cleansing. There it says, after this, Jesus and his mother and his brothers and his disciples went down to Capernaum, and there they stayed for a few days. And then it goes, now it was the time of Passover, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. So it's this totally pointless little note about them going to Capernaum and staying for a few days. If I were John's secretary, I would say, do we need that? I mean, you're not telling us anything about why they went to Capernaum or what happened in Capernaum. How about if we cut that out? And yet it's just in there. And I take that to be a really strong mark of not oral tradition, which could be altered, but what I would call oral history, such as you would get if you sat down with a veteran and turned on your tape recorder and recorded that guy, the way he would actually talk, that he would refer to things that he doesn't stop to explain, and so forth.
And that makes a world of sense. And I would say this also would equally apply for me to the texts of the Gospel of Matthew in some ways, although Matthew seems slightly more organized and polished on closer examination. But and maybe to Mark. I've always wondered whether Mark was the single oral rendition of Peter or not. But what it goes to show is, I think a lot of people they are ultimately put into a different headspace with the Johannine prologue. In Archaeologos, in the beginning was the Word. And they begin with this theological swooping beginning with probably a gorgeous English translation. And they don't realize from that point on, it really feels as if we are hearing a straightforward record of an eyewitness with his theological reflections, declaring what he saw, what we have seen, what we have heard. What would you make of the Johannine prologue, and also what would you make of in John chapter 19, the piercing in Christ's side? We bear witness to his testimony, and we know that his testimony is true. I know a lot of critical scholars love to insert there a Johannine community. Is it possible at all that John himself could have just simply had that line inserted later on? Is it possible the community inserted it? What do we make of those moments which seem to interrupt the narrative?
Well, of course, the prologue begins the narrative, so it can't interrupt it. You might find a little bit of an interruption in John 3, where I think the narrator is musing on the words of Jesus to Nicodemus. But I do think that it's quite clear the author of John believes that fake points don't make points, as I put it. So by fake points don't make points, what I mean is he doesn't think he can make a theological point by making up an event. He thinks theological depth arises from real events. And so in 1935, he says this fulfills they will look on him whom they have pierced, and not a bone of him shall be broken. But it's connected with this very gritty, realistic thing of them stabbing him with a spear in the side and blood and water coming out. Very sort of disgusting. Like you're standing there and you're actually seeing this horrible, very traumatic, I think. To witness a crucifixion must have been horribly traumatic of a person that you loved. And so he thinks that theological meaning comes because the thing really happened. And then he says, he who saw it bore record, and his record is true. And that's in 1935. Now, to refer to oneself in the third person, that's no problem. That would be common. St. Augustine mentions that writing and referring to oneself in the third person is done. It's done, I believe, in the Xenophon's Anabasis as well. So it's not, doesn't mean he couldn't have been an actual participant. What they like to really lean on is 21, I believe it's 24 and 25, at the very end, where it says, we know that his record is true. Now, the irony about this is that those two verses explicitly say that this is the disciple who wrote these things. But to see the way it's used by mainstream scholars, you'd almost think it said, this is not the disciple who wrote these things. They take it, they use it to mean the exact opposite of what it says. If anything, this is the one gospel that is not quote unquote anonymous, in the sense that Bart Ehrman will use that, and Ehrman will switch back and forth between two meanings, but that it claims to be written by an eyewitness, and it even uses the word graphene. This is a place where Richard Bauckham is completely right. He has some what I would call my favorite passage in Bauckham, where he just gets on a roll against scholars who try to use graphene, wrote, to mean he stood behind it theologically at some unknown distance. And he's like, yes, it could mean dictating to a scribe, but that's it. It doesn't mean, it's never used to mean that he stood behind it at some distance. So I tend to think that just those last couple of verses could be tacked on by someone who knew him as a kind of you might almost call it imprimatur, but to insist that everything up till that point was indeed written by the beloved disciple, and that is in fact what those verses say. And so therefore, in that sense, it supports the historicity and it supports the authorship by the beloved disciple. It doesn't undermine it.
What do you make of the arguments of, speaking of elements that are tacked on, of I believe it's the I am the vine, you are the branches chapter. I believe that's chapter 15, chapter 16.
Yeah, 15 is part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, where our Lord says, let us arise and go, basically, and you have the discourse immediately following, and of course you have John 21. It seems like the Gospel's ending at John 20, and of course you have the first Marvel movie post credit epilogue scene, where they are obviously in the boat on the Lake Tiberias in Galilee. It seems to me that this would, even if it was tagged on, that this would in no way invalidate issues of authorship. And I personally, as I've corresponded with you, I see no reason why John couldn't have been preaching from these same texts and then tagged them on in the 90s before passing, or even supplemented them as an elderly man, even shortly before his decease. What would we make of these, or is it necessary even to suggest that they were tacked on at all? I mean, Christ could have been communicating this while moving in the text. It doesn't necessitate layers of composition in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Well, I strongly agree with you about the let us arise and go. As you say, that has been used as an argument for what are called editorial seams, SEAMS, that this is, like a stitching point where somebody came along and stitched together different sections. I don't think that's true at all, because and what they'll try to use is that it'll say they went out over the winter torrent Kidron later, and then they'll say, well, so see, they didn't arise and go until later. Well, no, they didn't go across the brook Kidron until later, but that doesn't mean they didn't get up and leave the room, at the time when it says let us arise and go. So I don't see that as evidence of editorial activity at all. Now, the other one that you referred to was at the end of John 20. It's like, these are written that you may believe, and that believing you may have life through his name. And it's got this sort of ending feeling to it. And then you have the story in chapter 21 that comes after that about the great catch of fish and so forth. I think we don't want to be overly moved by the subjective feeling that something is an ending. This is a world without word processing. And I find that even in my world, where I do have word processing, I sometimes write things that sound like I'm wrapping up, and then I write more stuff, and then if I don't happen to go back, which I could easily do, and go cut and paste and say, oh man, that sounded like an ending there. I want to change that because it's not really the ending. And I don't always do that. So much the less when you're writing, in ink on, papyrus, that this could just be something he ended saying on that day. Or, as you say, maybe it's an appendix story also by the same author. Certainly the style is the same. I believe Richard Bauckham himself, who strongly advocates that it is by the same author, he just happens to think it's this other guy named John. He notes, if I recall correctly, that the use of Simon, the way that Jesus speaks to Peter is the same, is distinctive. So I think also the eye of the beholder is distinctive when he says that Peter stood up in the boat and he put on his garment before jumping in. Completely weird, pointless little detail. Normally, if you're going to swim, you don't put more clothes on. But that's just, that's what the guy saw. He put it on his garment. Maybe he didn't want to come semi-clothed or naked to meet Jesus, and he probably could swim when he was a little child, so it didn't matter to him. But either way, it's this vivid eyewitness appearance that it has that fits with the rest of the gospel. So I definitely don't think that that indicates a separate author, even of John 21. At the most, I might admit and probably would admit, those last couple verses read like a little tiny coda that somebody added to try to make it as clear as possible that this was written by Jesus' own personal beloved disciple.
What would you make of the argument, just referring back to the idea of amanuensis? I've heard it argued that Papias was the amanuensis of John, but I've never heard beyond the popular level this claim being substantiated. Is that in the Muratorian fragment? Is that in the second
It's
or
in the
third?
anti-Marcionite prologue.
And are we talking third century, fourth century for that?
No, it would be earlier than that. In fact, I'm trying to remember if it's Metzger. I think it might be Bruce Metzger who says that might even be the earliest attestation. It might even be earlier than the Ptolemy the Gnostic, as attesting that it was written by Jesus' disciple. And it says that Papias was his amanuensis. But there's a different part to it that I think is wrong, and it seems to be saying that oh man, I'm gonna get this wrong because I didn't look it up before I got on, but that John, the disciple, cast out Marcion. But
I think
Marcion,
you're correct on that
but
point.
that can't be right because Marcion was definitely later than John, the beloved disciple. So it looks like whoever that author is, an anonymous author of the anti-Marcionite prologue, he doesn't have all of his facts right. So we don't then want to lean too much on the statement that Papias was the amanuensis. Historically, it's a possibility that Papias's life, in fact, I think his life did overlap that of John, the beloved disciple, the son of Zebedee, who I believe is the author. So it's not impossible, but I wouldn't want to lean too much on it.
Brilliant. So that would be roughly second century then.
Yes, I believe the anti-Marcionite prologue would be second century.
All right, and that would be within the lifetime of also two, people like Irenaeus and others who would be maybe only two generations removed. If it's mid to late second century, and if it's earlier, hey, it could be in the lifetime of Ignatius. So
Right, right.
Now, quickly switching gears to just two final points. I mean, I could do this all day with you, as you know. The question of the upper room discourse is fascinating because the upper room discourse is unique in the sense that it seems to me as if we have a lot of unbroken dialogue of Christ. In the Synoptic Gospels, you do have long discourses, and you have the discourse against the Pharisees and Sadducees. You do have the Sermon on the Mount, which is largely uninterrupted as a text. But Christ in the upper room really is uniquely unpacking his heart, his intimacy, his teaching as the beloved teacher, and uniquely as divinity, as I would understand it traditionally. My question is, in terms of the composition, do you see any clues or any ideas in your reading or in your research that would suggest that John was working from notes from the upper room experience? Is this something that he would have committed to memory, the sitting at the feet of the master, sitting at the feet of the teacher, that he's recalling later on? It seems to me that such a pivotal discourse possibly could have been recorded much, much earlier in isolation, given how unique the events of that Pesach was and what occurred that the very fateful evening.
Right. Well, of course, you're right that the relative length of the upper room discourse has been used against its historicity. In fact, I believe the Sermon on the Mount is longer, not by much, if I recall correctly. And the upper room discourse is interrupted at points with little bits of dialogue as well. But what people will say is, it just would be impossible for him to remember this. Um, and then they'll say, well, it doesn't have to be absolutely verbatim recording, which I would agree, but then they'll take that too far and they'll say, he's making parts of it up. There's a distinction between, some recognizable paraphrase that isn't an absolute tape recorder and making stuff up. And we really need to draw that distinction hard and fast. What I like to talk about is recognizability. So if you'd been there and you understood the language Jesus was speaking, you'd go, "Oh, this is the vine of the branches discourse," and you knew it from modern translations. You'd be able to recognize it. So I think he did largely remember it. And I think he had been preaching on it for years. So it's not like, even if it gets written down, late in his life, it's not like he sat around and he never did anything to help it to stick in his memory for decades. And then suddenly, boom, it comes out and it's like it's been quietly stored silently in his mind for all these decades. I think he was rehearsing it. I think he was telling it as part of his preaching all along, and that'll fix it in your memory. I think we also tend to underestimate oral memory, auditory memory. And I don't want to blow my own horn here too much, but my parents used to tell a story of me as a little child, under the age of 2, walking up to my pastor and beginning to rattle off the First Thessalonians passage. I think it's First Thessalonians. "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God." And I wasn't even 2 years old yet. And it was because I had heard them trying to teach it to my brother, who was 4 or 5, by reading it to him over and over again. And he hadn't learned it, but I had. So actually, when and I've lost a lot of that as I've grown older. But as a child, I had a pretty remarkable audiographic memory. And I think the beloved disciple may have had that as well. One final point I'll make about that upper room discourse. One of the dialogue interruptions, it's Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, "Lord, why do you show yourself to us and not to the world?" I believe that's a question he asks. Judas, not Iscariot, is the existence of a separate Judas as one of the 12 is attested by Luke. But Luke doesn't call him Judas, not Iscariot. So that's a very awkward way of referring to him. And it is, to my mind, therefore, a mark of historicity, that not only is the existence of this person multiply attested in different wording in a different gospel, but also that John refers to him in such a way that he remembers specifically that this guy was the one who asked. If you were making that up, why not have it be somebody different who asks the question? Why have the guy who asks the question be a different guy named Judas, whom you haven't mentioned anywhere else? And now you have to pause and tell your readers, "Oh, by the way, it wasn't that rotter Judas Iscariot. It was Judas, not Iscariot." Super awkward thing to do. So I think that's a mark that he really is remembering the discourse.
100%. And in fact, the fact that that is the one place he appears in the Gospel of John, you would put that in the mouth of someone like a Thomas, who has already been introduced in the text, if you were doing this literary device thing, like Lacona is. As we near towards the end here, some final questions about the idea of the I am statements, which are something we've discussed, how they've been employed as a mark against the fourth gospel. It was how we really first got in contact when we met, because of the way it was just plaguing my conscience and my mind as I was looking for solidly good answers. And we've discussed how, of course, you have the Johannine thunderbolt and the synoptics. So John speaks in a Johannine way in the synoptic literature. Pardon me, there is a foghorn in the background. There we go.
No problem.
Yes. New married life, moving to Main Street here. But yeah, basically, we've discussed also too how there is synoptic-like material also in the fourth gospel. We have Jesus using the very familiar idioms. Unless the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it's very similar to agricultural images found in the Synoptic Gospels. Um, you know, when you see the grain being such and such, look up or lift up your eyes, I think is one phrase given in the Samaritan village. So one element I was asking you in the very beginning was if the synoptics are able to supplement with the nativity accounts in Luke and in Matthew, and they do supplement one another, no matter if one takes Mark in priority or Matthew in priority. Why can't John the Beloved Disciple also supplement given eyewitness material? And what would you make to the argument that is, I think it was Bart Ehrman who made it. Why would the synoptics miss out on something as colossally big as before Abraham was I am? Wouldn't that be the chief focus? I have tons of arguments against that, I think, rather weak argument from silence approach. But I'm eager to get your thoughts on it if you have it.
Right. Well, my husband Tim will say from time to time, where would critical New Testament scholars be if it weren't for the argument from silence? Like, they just love that one. They really do. And I have a video your viewers may be interested in called Arguments from Silence, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So, I could probably get you that link if you want to link it in the show notes as well. But yes. Arguments from silence are very weak, especially when they're used against testimony. So the illustration I will use is, suppose I have several family members who have been out and about in the town on a given day. One of them comes home and says, did you know there was a car accident on, and names a major intersection, tells me about it. Then other members of the family come home who would have driven through that intersection, and they don't happen to mention that there was an accident. Do I say, well, the first person probably made it up because of the silence of the other people, that surely they would have mentioned it? No, if I have reason to think that first person is reliable, which I do, I'm not going to use it. It would be very poor. There could be all kinds of reasons why they might not have mentioned it. So Ehrman kind of, it's like a person forcing a card. He'll use a word like surely they would have said this. And so what that amounts to is the assumption that they had this goal. Let's, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, let's try to find the strongest statement that Jesus ever made, asserting his deity, and we want to include that. But do we know that they sat down and had that goal? Matthew is certainly focused on Jesus' messiahship. He also, of course, includes the Trinitarian formula, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. But we don't know that he's going and scrounging around to try to find the strongest thing that Jesus ever said. And I think it's also important to remember that for a man to stand there and say, before Abraham was I am, is not in itself a miracle. So the I am statements will be treated almost as if they are miracles, as if they have this low prior probability and they face a huge burden of proof. I don't think that's true. These are mundane occurrences. It's not a mundane thing for Jesus to be God, but it is a mundane, in the sense of a non-miraculous thing, for him to claim to be God. So when we have so much other evidence of the reliability of John in recording historical things, I see no reason why we shouldn't take him to be historically recording Jesus' claims to be God, as well as his I am sayings with predicates like I am the bread of life and so forth. And I 100% agree with you, and Eusebius said this as well, that John was self-consciously supplementing the other Gospels. You can well imagine him saying, okay, the parables, those have been done. Right?
Yeah.
Like, people will make this big deal. Why doesn't John have any parables? What, do you not think we have enough parables? They did the parables, but they didn't do the foot washing. They didn't do some of these arguments with the Jewish crowds culminating in the attempts to stone him, I'm going to include that. So it's almost like you have the footsteps in the snow of the synoptics, and then you have John coming along with a different set of footprints with a different, pattern on the bottom of the boot in the snow that's stepping in between the footsteps of the synoptics. And I think that's what's going on.
And I think it makes a world of sense. I mean, one of the counter arguments that always is made in my circles is, me being a more conservative scholar. Well, John, don't you employ the argument of silence, saying that the synoptics were written before the fall of Jerusalem because they make no mention of the martyrdom of Peter and no mention of the martyrdom of Paul. And of course, the absence of any gloss saying, and this was fulfilled, as Jesus said. But I would say that that's special pleading at the end of the day, because ultimately there is a fundamental difference using, as you said, the argument of silence to argue against testimony versus actually using silence to argue in favor for testimony. Because one is discounting existing evidence, where the other is simply looking at the absence of evidence and drawing clues. Would you say that's safe?
I think there's truth to that, but I also think that argument from silence used in favor of the earliness of the synoptics can be greatly supplemented in ways that are much better even than that argument from silence. And I don't want to go too far afield, but in the case of Luke, I would argue even more from the absence at the end of Paul's trial before the emperor, because he's been following the career of Paul so carefully. So I think we can supplement this with the positive preoccupations of the author of Luke, and thus make a much stronger argument, which is not merely an argument from silence, for the earliness of Acts, thereby arguing for the earliness of Luke, which is certainly before Acts, thereby arguing for the even earlier earliness of Mark and Matthew. So that's the way I would run it, even more so than by those specific arguments from silence that you just mentioned.
Brilliant. No, I want to mention, because whenever I make the argument absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, the whole Tim Mahoney line, inevitably someone gets back to me and says, but don't you apply the same standards on the synoptics in defense of the I am statements? And it becomes quite mind-boggling. Definitely eager to put that one to bed. So.
Yeah. Well, all of this is probabilistic, of course. And I will also send you a link to my husband Tim's completely secular article, or at least to the reference for it. I don't know if the whole article is available for free online, but on arguments from silence and evaluating them in a Bayesian way. But I think we can do even better for the synoptics than that stuff that they try to stick us with as a double standard. And so if somebody ever tried that on me, that's what I do. But I agree with you that in terms of the, as it were, posterior probability, an argument from silence where you're trying to dismiss testimony as a much more dubious appearance to it than an argument that's just a small probabilistic clue, and that one doesn't try to lean too much on, and one doesn't try to set against testimony. So I would agree with you there.
Excellent. Well, Lydia, thank you for your time. I am very, very, very grateful for this. And I want those listening to definitely, if they are curious, look much more deeply into Eye of the Beholder, which definitely goes through not just some of these arguments, but a lot more depth into the material. And is there anywhere else they should be looking at your work, Lydia, in terms of your YouTube page, any other additional work you're doing on your blog, etc., and anything that you're working on now that you would want to advertise or highlight?
Well, I'm not writing a new book right now, but my book Testimonies to the Truth did just recently go into Kindle, so you can get it in Kindle as well as in paper, and some people really like Kindle. So, and now inevitably I'm going to have somebody say, do you have it in audiobook? And it's like, for goodness sake, how many different formats do I have to have it in? But it did just recently go into Kindle. And so I would encourage people to get hold of that. That's called Testimonies to the Truth. I'm working really hard at this time to keep up my content on my YouTube channel. My friend Eric Manning ports over the audio from that to a pure audio podcast available on, Spotify and any place like that. The Lydia McGrew podcast, that's the audio of my YouTube channel. And people can follow Lydia McGrew author on Facebook. And I do post notes and updates and, sometimes slightly blog-like things on there. And on just Lydia McGrew, my public, excuse me, my public content gets shared there as well. You do not have to be a Facebook friend of mine to read that public content. So you can follow any of those things. And just, I'm trying to do new content all the time. Right now, for my YouTube channel, I am working hard on a series on the so-called phenomenon of editorial fatigue, which is in fact almost invariably a theory that the authors made things up. It's been popularized by Mark Goodacre. So I've been really digging deep into that and rebutting that in my current series. So if you're interested in that kind of really geeky stuff, tune into the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. My motto is making common sense rigorous.
I love the idea of making common sense rigorous. And it echoes in my mind words given by Dr. Peter Kraft recently about valuing even common sense at times in union with reason, but sometimes over a hyper-rationality, which ceases to be rational. So brilliant, brilliantly done. Thank you, as always, Lydia, and very eager to have you on again, for sure.
Thank you, John, so much for having me.